As we heard in the children's story this morning, the history of child labor in this country, both paid and unpaid, is deeply disturbing. It's important to learn about this part of Montana and U.S. history so that we can see where its influences are beginning to resurface, and also the influences who have continued for children who work on farms and immigrant children. So make no mistake, widespread child labor is coming back to us in this country with force, and we need to be vigilant. So a few weeks ago, when Sandra suggested this topic for the Labor Day service, let me just say, I was resistant, I was not inspired, I was like, I am so not doing that. But you can't say no to Sandra. And I also started to think about, I come from a family of labor organizers, and I forget this from time to time. And it is so critically important. I'm a little bit embarrassed that I forget. And you know me, I'm not big on perfection, so I'm okay with being embarrassed. My great Aunt Rose was tossed out of Minnesota at gunpoint for her union organizing work, and also her advocacy for prisoners who were forced labor for logging. And what she was trying to do is have them paid so that when they were released from incarceration, they had the ability to have a new start by having a small financial cash. So she was unpopular in Minnesota. But then she came to Seattle, the Seattle area, which is where I'm from, and she joined union organizers there. I don't know if she went through Butte on her way, but it would not surprise me. One of the many things she organized was on-site childcare for railroad clerks, who were often asked to extend their hours with little or no notice. So on-site childcare was important. As my father was a railroad man and a union representative, he and Great Aunt Rose were often in the kitchen talking for hours. I will also mention, before my father was a union representative, he was just a regular railroad employee. And the week he became the union representative, he purchased a handgun. That had never happened in our house before. We would target shoot with rifles, but we didn't have guns as self-defense. And that's how dangerous it was to be a union representative in the past decades. So back to Great Aunt Rose, she was eventually asked to leave the Seattle area, branded as a communist, hanging out with the wrong people, and she went off to Alaska, where she homesteaded in Wasilla. She took in pregnant teenage girls who had been sex workers. The town of Wasilla was aghast. How could she do such a thing, as if they all didn't know how these young women got pregnant in the first place? So, union organizing is just a tell-it-like-it-is profession. So I have the unions on that side, and then I have my father, who I've talked about before. He came to Bozeman at the age of 13 and worked as child labor from the age of 13 to 18. He did not attend school, he worked. Not in mining, he worked here in Bozeman. So as I reviewed those family stories, I was like, I'm super excited about this sermon, but I'm also a minister. This isn't about my family. It is about, as I said before, we borrow from, we learn from story, we read sacred texts. We don't have a creed about what you have to believe in this faith, but we have principles, which are on the back of your order of service. And child labor falls under our first principle, inherent worth, but it really also falls under our second principle, which is about justice, equity, and compassion that we need to have in these past stories and we need to have for kids growing up today. Okay, so Sandra also inspired me. Let me just say, I went over to the Mining Museum in Butte, and for those of you who haven't done this, I really recommend it. Little tour of the historic district, then you go over to the Mining Museum, then you go up to Granite Mountain Memorial. You can spend the whole day in Butte, and it's way more fun than you think it's going to be. From 1870, so I want to say two things. I got information from this sermon from Sandra, who supplied things from the Montana Historical Society. I also got some information at the museum. And I also want to do a shout out to Teresa Nichols Schuster, who I believe is in the back, who wrote a historical fiction called Brittle Silver, which really piqued my interest in because it is about mining in Montana. So in Butte, you can see the memorial that says over 2,500 men lost their lives in mining-related causes. They lost more men than was average for other mining projects in other states. And of course, that doesn't count the tens of thousands who were maimed and could no longer work, and 40% of miners with serious respiratory conditions which shortened their lives. The average life expectancy of a miner in Montana, depending on which decade and which mine, was 32 to 39 years. Most statistics are the 37 to 39 years. So all of that illness and early death also impacted children, because it was not uncommon to have maiming or an early death of a parent, and children went to work to make up the income. Many children were poorly housed, poorly clothed, poorly fed. 20% of children did not see their 5th birthday, and 50% of the child mortality occurred in the first year of life. And from Sandra's reading, you can also understand part of that was just respiratory condition, and infants are more vulnerable. I also learned, I want to take just a quick aside from those grim statistics and look at the ethnic history in the 1800s, because it's fascinating, in the early 1900s. So attracted by the mining, the Cornish and the Irish came first. And at one point in Butte, 25% of the miners were Irish. And I really could see that reflected in the museum and on the memorial when you read all the names. Then came Italians and Finns and Swedes and Serbians, Croatians, Slovenians, Montenegrins, Syrians, and Lebanese. The east side of Butte was Austrian and Serbian. The Irish lived uptown a little further, and up above Park Street were the Finns. Meaderville was strongly Italian, and of course, Catholicism was quite represented in Butte, which also was a part of providing enough schools for kids. But no ethnic group was spared the conditions of toxic fumes from the smelters and killing of the vegetation. Children always find places to play, and the pictures of kids playing in what would now be considered a toxic waste dump is pretty horrifying. By the time schools were more abundant and education was compulsory, many children were juggling the demands of work and school in order to contribute to the family income. Parents worked in the mines, in smelters, in stores, restaurants, boarding houses. There were so many boarding houses, hospitals, but there was still sometimes not enough for the family, especially when there'd been an early death or disability of the worker. So our ideas about child labor came over from England, and I want to read you something from 1575 in Elizabethan law. Elizabethan law passed laws to employ children as, quote, a prophylactic against vagabonds and paupers, unquote. The famous century philosopher John Locke, a celebrated leader of liberty, argued that children as young as 3 should be part of the labor force. Alexander Hamilton, another one of our people we put on a pedestal, advocated for children as cheap labor. In the US by 1820, 40% of the mill workers in New England were children, many 6 to 12 years old. After the Civil War, children of formerly enslaved people were pressed into highly exploitive apprenticeships. And between 1890 and 1910, 18% of all children between the ages of 10 and 15 over 2 million worked, often 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Statistics from Philadelphia around the turn of the century, 1900, indicate that children brought between 28 and 33% of household income for parents born in America, and even more for immigrant families. So by the turn of the 20th century, child labor had become an issue of public concern. And across the United States, children worked on the streets, they worked in agriculture, they worked in mills, they worked in factories, and they worked in mines. And I suspect, although this is never written about, that a good deal of them worked in prostitution. Montana took the issue of child labor seriously, and they responded earlier than many states. In 1904, Otto Schoenfeld, who was the first director of the state's Bureau of Child and Animal Protection, better than no protection. Yeah, actually, the first legal intervention for abuse of a child came from the Society of Protection of Animals in New York City. So those have been connected for a while. So by that time in Montana, children under 16 were prohibited from working in the mines, although some, of course, still did, just lying about their age. And children under 14 were supposedly not allowed to be employed in other positions. Schoenfeld was stressing the importance of compulsory education and protecting children from work that would interfere with schooling. And while all of this was really important and revolutionary and ahead of other states, it was a disconnect between what was going on with the politicians and what was actually happening in Butte. Children already had hands-on jobs before the age of 14. They filled miners' lunch buckets. You can see all these pictures of the miners going down into the deep mines, and they have a bucket where they have some tools, but they also have a lunch packed inside the bucket. So kids were packing those lunches. They sold newspapers and magazines. They worked in private homes. They worked in stores, and they worked in restaurants. So politicians were working on child labor. Unions also got involved in this, although not entirely for altruistic purposes. I don't want to say that there wasn't concern for children, but unions also knew children were exploited for lesser wages. So industry would rather employ children for less than employ adults. So the unions were trying to get in there and get rid of the child labor. So while girls and boys filled the miners' lunch buckets, worked in private homes, worked in other places, it was the boys who became the corner newsboys. The stories we hear. I suspect also girls cut off their hair, pretended to be boys, because this was a way they could make some money. And starting as young as 8 or 9, they purchased newspapers at 2 newspapers for a nickel. And then they sold them for 5 cents apiece. Some sold as many as 100 newspapers a day, although most not. And it was legendary for defending their turf. And this, of course, involved violence with other newsboys who might have been trying to get that particular corner. There was a lot of writing about the newsboys. The older kids would hand down their corner to the younger ones in a family. There started to be public concern because these boys were like roaming around. And so union leaders and businessmen worked together, and I think it was the Temperance Union, to form the Butte Newsboys Club. They tried to provide some supervision, some life skills. They had speakers. The Carpenters Hall said, hey, they can meet here for nothing. Again, I'm noting girls were left out of that community building enterprise. In 1914, the newsboys went on strike for a better financial arrangement, but they were not successful. There are many boys who started this trade by the age of 8 or 9 and even younger. If I read this, we're going to run a little long today, but I think it's actually worth it to hear from a newsboy who started at the age of 8, but this is his adult retrospective. He said, I turned everything over to my mother, 25 or 35 cents. I sold the Butte Daily Post. I would sell the paper in the afternoon. It came out at 4:30, right after school. And what made that all possible is in the downtown area, there were places where the tenants were all men who worked in the mines. They were bachelors. One room was enough for them. They would go to boarding houses for meals or to restaurants. And that was the great place to market your newspapers. Any time of day or night, Butte would be busy because the streetcars I mentioned before brought them up to the mines and back. They'd come pouring down from the hill, hundreds of men, and every corner throughout Park Street and Broadway had newsboys on them. The night shift began at 6 and got off at 2:30 in the morning, so they would still be out selling newspapers at 2:30 in the morning. And then he remembers Christmas, and this would have been a little later. He said, as I grew older, the Christmas season started being a special time in Butte from Thanksgiving until Christmas. Merchants kept their stores open till 9 instead of 6. At that time, there were all kinds of people downtown shopping. By then, they had developed phonographs and people could listen to records out on the street. Music stores had speakers outside their stores, and that's how I became a fan of Bing Crosby. End of quote. As Butte and the nation continued to rid itself of much child labor, children on farms and immigrants did not enjoy these protections. That was my father working on a ranch. And today, capitalism is moving us back to child labor. I saw research in The Nation, in the New York Times, and then the TomDispatch.com. They report these statistics from 2015 to 2022. The number of children at work in the U.S. increased 37% from 2015 to 22. In the last 2 years, 14 states have either introduced or enacted legislation rolling back regulations that govern the number of hours children can be employed, and they have lowered the restrictions on dangerous work, and they have legalized sub-minimum wages for use. Iowa now allows people as young as 14 to work in industrial laundries. And can you imagine the temperature of water in an industrial laundry? At age 16, they can take jobs in roofing, construction, excavation, demolition, and can operate power-driven machinery of all types. 14-year-olds can work night shifts. In Florida and Tennessee, roofers can now be as young as 12. Recently, the Labor Department, this was all over our national news, found more than 100 children between the ages of 13 and 17 working in meatpacking plants and slaughterhouses in Minnesota and Nebraska for large companies like Tyson Foods and Packer Sanitation. So the good news in Montana is Montana still limits the number of hours and how late in the evening teens can work on school days. Teens under the age of 18. For the most part, they can't work in mining or manufacturing or hazardous occupations or using blasting agents. However, although there are some apprenticeships in which they can engage in some of that work, however, they can unload 9-inch in diameter pieces, long logs, timber, 9 inches or less, and they can work on scaffolding up to 20 feet into the air. The cold reality is child labor plays off for employers and is becoming more commonplace. The marketplace is starting to see as a norm child labor. With the COVID-19 pandemic, it was the perfect cover story for the child labor. It became perfect pretext for voicing the importance of putting kids to work because we didn't have enough workers. But the reality is much of that occurred before the COVID shutdown. Children are dropping out of school to work. Migrant children are especially vulnerable to child labor. Work is increasingly dangerous. partially because it's non-unionized and it's being stripped of benefits. So as Unitarian Universalists, we need to care because our principles guide us to justice, equity, and compassion. So we need to be vigilant in remaining educated about what is happening in Montana and our country, so we can talk about it and so we can vote. Because Unitarians love to vote. I will close with the words of author Stephen Fraser. It should be a reminder of how deeply retrogressive capitalism has once again become, both here at home and elsewhere around the planet. This country is now experiencing a border crisis, and its origins lie on this side of the border. Amen, and I will not say blessed be.